So first off, with an overview, insects help angiosperms to reproduce sexually with distant members of their own species, and plant life cycles are characterized by the alternation of multicellular haploid generation in and multicellular diploid generation 2N. Diploid sporophytes 2N produce spores in by meiosis, which grow into haploid gametophytes in. Now, what are angiosperms? They are dormant, and an angiosperm's life cycle is characterized by the 3 F's: flowers, double fertilization, and fruits. They depend on insects and other animals that pollinate, and angiosperm pollination is the transfer of pollen from another, this being insects or how they pollinate. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how they reproduce, and this can occur through asexual reproduction, which can occur through fragmentation, which is when a parent plant kind of separates and becomes into 2 different plants. It can occur through apoxmis, which is when a diploid cell becomes a seed, and this is important because there's no sperm or egg involved in apoxmis. Some other interesting things is when dioecious plants lack carpels or lack stamens, which prevent self-fertilization, or if a plant is self-incompatible, which this is when the plant rejects pollen from itself or closely related plants. And then even vegetative propagation, which is when humans facilitate vegetative reproduction. Plants can also reproduce through sexual reproduction, which is just 2 parents and 1 offspring. Then there are things like endosperm development. The endosperm actually precedes embryo development. The endosperm stores nutrients that can be used by the seedling, and food serves are exported to the cotyledon, which is actually the first leaf to appear from a germinating seed. Then there is embryo development. This is when the zygote splits from the fertilized egg into a basal cell and then into a terminal cell. The basal cell produces a multicellular suspensor that connects the embryo to a parent plant. Then the terminal cell gives rise to the embryo. The next slide shows 4 different methods of pollination, one of them being wind. This is when flowers use the wind to push out large amounts of pollen so they can be reproductive. Insects are actually guided by the color of the flower and are rewarded with nectar. Birds focus on the shape of the flower so that their beak can match the shape of the floral tube. And bats actually use their sense of smell to find a flower that they like. A fun fact is that bats are responsible for pollinating the flower used to ferment tequila. So the next few slides focus on flowers, structure, and function. Flowers are the reproductive shoots of the angiosperm sporophyte, and they attach to the part of the stem called receptacle. Flowers consist of 4 floral organs: carpels, stamens, petals, and sepals. Carpels and stamens are reproductive organs. Sepals and petals are sterile. A carpel has a long style with a stigma on which pollen may land. At the base of the style is an ovary containing 1 or more ovules. A single carpel or group of carpels can be defined as a pistil. A stamen consists of a filament with anther with pollen sacs that produce pollen. And complete flowers contain all 4 organs, and an incomplete flower lacks 1 or more organs. So next we have ABC hypothesis, which explains the formation of the 4 types of floral organs through the regulatory activity of 3 classes of organ identity genes. A genes, which are sepals and petals, B genes, which are petals and stamens, and C genes, which are stamens and carpels. If genes are incorrectly activated, then sometimes it can lead to alternate placement of organs, sometimes it leads to an incomplete flower, and sometimes it can lead to extra petals where stamens are supposed to be. Then we have alternation of generations. Here you can see that the blue arrows represent haploid, and the red arrows represent diploid. Then here we can see the development of gametophytes. The gap in female development is called a microphyll. The protective layers of tissue in female development are called integuments. Then we have double fertilization. This is when the tube cell of the pollen grain begins to form the pollen tube. The pollen tube is guided by chemicals released from synergids. The gap is called the microphyll, and then double fertilization gets its name from the 2 sperm that are used. This makes sure nutrients are not wasted on infertile ovules. Then we have seed formation, which is when it starts as an endosperm, becomes multicellular, It becomes a zygote and then splits into a basal and terminal cell. The terminal cell becomes the embryo, and the basal the suspensor, and then eventually it goes into dormancy and stops growing. On the next slide we have a diagram of seed structure, and there's not much to say here. And then this slide shows how a seed becomes a seedling. So it'll start in the ground, of course, and then sprout up, and then its cotyledon will shrivel and eventually fall off, and it'll become a big old plant. Then there are 2 slides on how fruit is developed, and then the next slide is how fruit and seeds are dispersed. Through the wind, they form a wing or a parachute-like structure that enables them to glide with the wind. Water, some fruits develop buoyancy so they can be carried by the ocean. And animals, they obviously take them away from where they find them. There you go. And then the last 3 slides are just some notes on GMOs, some research, and a few definitions.